Listo.
Pues buenos días a todos nuestros participantes. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros de nuevo. Pues hoy tengo el gusto de presentarles al doctor Vito Vasconcelos. Él es profesor asistente en la Universidad de Ámsterdam.
Adelante.
E investigador visitante en la Universidad de Princeton.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, pues sin más, le doy la palabra a Víctor, agradeciéndole de nuevo su apoyo por participar acá con nosotros. Adelante.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Ricardo. Yeah, today I have the pleasure to talk to you a little bit about some of my most recent research in polarization. But before I do that, I would also like to introduce a little bit of my broader research interest. I would also like to ask the participants to ask questions at any time. And you can ask your questions in Spanish and I can try to understand. I think I was practicing earlier and it seemed doable. So yeah, please interrupt me at any time. I have prepared probably, 1 hour of me talking and then hopefully a lot of time for questions and discussion. So yeah, feel free to interrupt me at any time. So as Ricardo said, I am an assistant professor at the Computational Science Lab at the University of Amsterdam. I'm an invited researcher at Princeton, but I'm also affiliated with the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Amsterdam, here on the bottom left. This is a place where I do a lot of research, but also some educational projects and a lot of interaction with the stakeholders and looking at questions from the municipality, from different companies, because in fact, we live in a time that is pretty crazy, where we have this perfect storm for asking questions on complexity, right? So we all know that we are facing a lot of urgent problems like climate change, ecological collapse, that require very urgent solutions. So understanding complexity is really my inspiration and how we can use that understanding to manage the threats that we face. In particular, my research is at the interface of governance, humans, and their resources. So in governance, I ask questions about how institutions emerge, but also what interventions are effective in this case, in the human society and also in the resources that they use. Here on the bottom left, I also focus on human dynamics, so social dynamics, more generally computational social science, where I look at phenomena of peer influence, but also how individuals make decisions in structured networks using tools like game theory and in evolutionary game theory to look at the evolution of different behaviors. And then kind of as a hobby or in my free time, I look into ecological systems, so some natural systems and some engineered systems. And of course, the whole goal is to connect these three things. So how do humans interact with one another? How does that lead to the emergence and stability of governance structures? And then how well, these two can sustain the natural and engineered systems that they rely on. For today's talk, I'll be talking about polarization. So of course, there's a connection to governance, but it'll lie mostly in the interaction between individuals. The guide for the talk is to show you that polarization affects the ability of individuals to solve coordination problems. So, spoiler alert, this is the result. It does affect our ability to solve these problems. And how I'll show you this is I'll look into different types of polarization, in particular issue-based polarization and affective polarization. I'll show that the existence of these types depends on the type of process of opinion dynamics that you have on your networks, on your population. And finally, I will show that when these types are present, then individuals sometimes are better at coordinating and sometimes they are worse. So the overall question is, well, does polarization affect behavior? Is polarization bad for decision making? And this is a work with a team at the University of Kassel in Germany, a team of two behavioral economists, Astrid Dannenberg and Marcel Rumkowski, as well as two psychologists, Sarah Constantino and Elke Weber, and an ecologist, Simon Levin, the three of them from Princeton University. And you can read some details of this work in our paper from the end of last year called Segregation and Clustering of Preferences Erode Socially Benefit Coordination. So let's get at it. What is polarization? And why does it matter for the economy? So here I am showing you the study by the Pew Research Center, where they have asked politicians a series of questions. These questions are here on the left, and they constitute this ideological consistency scale. So basically, it incorporates questions of government efficiency. So for instance, if government is always wasteful or not, and is it good for businesses or not, whether poverty traps exist or not, or is just people's fault that they're poor, if immigrants are a burden, what else? In terms of environmental laws, if they are too costly or not, in terms of jobs, about sexual orientation, etc. And what they did is, well, within this scale, from very liberal stances to very conservative stances, they asked different politicians what they think. And what they saw, not surprisingly, is that Democrats tend to have a more liberal leaning stance, and Republicans tend to have a more conservative stance. And we see that from 1994 to 2004, this variation, well, there's some variation, but there wasn't a big shift in these stances. But from 2004 to 2014, and now we'll be waiting for the 2024 series, we see a big divide, especially between Democrats and Republicans. And this is what we call polarization in terms of different issues. So people have different opinions, different stances on certain issues. And that basically reflects one type of polarization, which is issue-based polarization. It's not much more than a typically binomial distribution of opinions. But of course, there is a different type of polarization, which is actually much stronger and has a lot more impact, which is affective polarization. And affective polarization happens when a certain group develops animosity towards a different group. So it relies a lot on the existence of groups and the strong effects of identity, and in particular when the identity of a group is basically to have a strong stance against a different group. that generates effective polarization. Any questions? I hear some noises. I don't know if someone has a question. Feel free to interrupt me. So what I want to show you is that, well, these two types of polarization, they interact with one another. And now I cannot skip my slides. There you go. So depending on the type of process, the type of opinion, the type of issue that is being propagated in a network, we can have different combinations of these effects. So, and to show you that, I will go back to a previous paper of ours where we look at the propagation of competing ideas or competing opinions in a certain network. I'll do this very briefly. So this paper is actually inspired in some empirical results where we have, well, the Carsey-Martin et al. Have explored the process of spreading of online innovation. So in this case, just for this particular image, it was about the adoption, not of an opinion, but of a technology. And it shows the probability that a certain individual adopts the technology, in this case it was Skype, as a function of the number of neighbors that were adopting Skype. And then we see that, well, non-surprisingly, that probability increases. So the more individuals are adopting a certain technology, or the more individuals have certain opinions in your neighborhood, the more likely you are to adopt such an opinion. But interestingly, these shapes may vary depending on the underlying process. Here we see that we have a more convex shape than one would expect at random. So our question is, well, what happens when we have not just one technology, or in this case, one opinion, but we actually have multiple opinions conflicting with one another? What happens then? Which one does dominate? Can they both coexist? What are the different dynamics? So we developed these family of competing contagion processes that is characterized. Here we have the exact same graph, just generalized, where an individual that might be blue is looking at their neighborhood and seeing how many other are blue and how many other are red. So they ask, what are my friends doing? And then depending on the fraction of neighbors doing, for instance, red, there is a probability that they also adopt red. So exactly like the empirical findings. And what we have now is a family of functions that can be either convex or concave or linear for the probability of adopting these. And of course, you can have this probability both in terms of an individual that is blue becoming red, or an individual that is red becoming blue, and they don't have necessarily to be the same. So when we look at these, at the possibilities for these two parameters that control the interaction of these two types of behaviors. So if here on the x-axis we plot what controls how hard it is to go from B to A, and how hard it is to go from A to B, we can find 4 different scenarios. So the first scenario, let's maybe start here on the top, is a simple one, where if the probability of adopting opinion A grows very fast at the beginning and then saturates, and the opposite happens for B, then A dominates, right? So A is much more likely to be adopted at all times, so A dominates. The reverse happens in the reverse case, if B is much easier, but the most interesting cases lie on this diagonal. So if both opinions are actually require a lot of reinforcement from the neighbors, which means we have this convex response function where it takes a lot of individuals before we get a high probability of adopting a different strategy. Then we find that the population has some kind of coordination dynamics. Depending on the initial number of neighbors that you have, you might end up, the whole population actually might end up adopting opinion A or opinion B. When they're both very easy to adopt as a function of the neighborhood, then you actually see a coexistence of these two opinions. So overall, these are the same kinds of scenarios, just in a lattice. What we see is that, okay, we have these either, in this case, the black points dominate or the white points dominate in the diagonal, anti-diagonal, or we have these more interesting phenomena. I'll just replay the video again. So we see that when we have the concave responses where they're both very easy to adopt, what we see is the coexistence in a very dynamic population where the opinions keep changing, whereas in the opposite case, where they're very hard to adopt, we see these very strong correlations, so very strong, very big domains of a certain behavior. And of course, lattices are not so interesting, so you can do this on a network, and what you observe is something very similar. So either you have, if opinions are hard to change, then you can have these consensus where you either end up in everyone adopting A or everyone adopting B, or you can have a mix of both. So you could think of this as some kind of consensus where everyone can end up just having the same opinion, or you can think of this as some kind of polarization where you at least issue polarization, because you look at the population and there is not just a single opinion. There are actually, in this case, two, because it's the maximum we allowed. But of course, this is a bit more nuanced, because depending on the network structure, in particular, if the network structure has very high modularity, then you can have this consensus region actually being a polarization region, where now one module adopts a certain opinion and the other module adopts the other opinion. Whereas in the simple, in the case where the behaviors are simple to adopt, or actually the opinions are simple to adopt, you see a mix of both. Now, what I'd like to argue is that whereas here there is no issue-based polarization, because there is only one issue presence, in all of these, there are issue-based polarization, but these two here are clearly different, right? Here we see what we actually think of when we talk about polarization, which is that we have these very closed clusters of individuals that share an opinion, and then there is the other group that shares the opposite opinion. Whereas this can also occur depending on the underlying process, but it's not exactly what we think when we talk about polarization. And so that means that the creation of these modules is crucial for the existence or not of issue-based polarization. In particular, the segregation of the opinions in these networks. And here is just an illustration. So if we have many groups that individuals belong to, then we can see, I'm sorry, the image is so small, and we allow these groups to have a kind of effective polarization where they can rewire their connections into their own groups, and they can break connections to the different groups depending on their opinions. Then you see the formation of these clusters, and you see that opinions can get kind of divided among these clusters. So with that, we can go back into our question of whether polarization, and in particular different types of polarization, contribute or not to behavior. So we will look into the interaction between these two and how they lead to different behaviors. And behavior of an individual is usually determined by two things. The first, or at least in a utilitarian perspective, individuals have subjective evaluations of different outcomes that might depend on their opinions, right? So if there is a distribution of opinions in the population, that might induce a distribution of valuations of different outcomes, right? And that valuation determines behavior. So if I believe that a certain behavior is good, either morally or just because I like it, then I'm more likely to adopt such behavior. The opposite being the case too. But the other thing that also determines my behavior is not just my evaluation of different outcomes, is what others are doing. And in particular, my perception of what others are doing, because the outcome of my actions depends on, in general, might depend on what others do. And of course, affective polarization can affect both of those. So what we're going to do to answer this question of does polarization affect behavior is split this into a simpler question, where we can show that even in the best case scenario, polarization has a role to play. So what we do is that we take a simple coordination game. So individuals in a population need to coordinate in order to achieve a good outcome. And in this best case scenario, we take a situation in which there is some polarization, but all individuals agree on which outcome is the best. The thing is that they value this best outcome differently, okay? So they agree that it's the best outcome, but to different degrees, okay? And finally, they make that decision of what to do based on the information that they get about what others are going to do. So there is a network structure that affects the information about what others do. So we can think of this part as the issue-based polarization, so how much they value things, and that's based on their opinions, in this part of the network structure as deriving from affective polarization, right? If there is affective polarization in the individual, then we expect in the population, then we expect the individuals to be more segregated than if there wasn't. So the stylized collective action problem is the following one. Each individual has to make one choice between two different actions. They can do S or R. And S stands for a safe choice. So if individuals decide to do S, we can think of it as business as usual. So they get a baseline payoff of 1 unit irrespectively of what others do. So here, if we plot the behavior of others, so the number of other individuals playing R, the reward of an individual that plays S is always 1. If the individual decides to play R, then it depends on what others do. If not enough individuals also play R, then they don't get the unit. They lose 1 unit. So they lose this difference. Otherwise, they get a high benefit, which is bigger than 1 for all individuals. So this one is the risky choice, because by taking option R to get the high reward, they need to rely on others to also take this chance. So we can think of R as a cooperative action since it also enables others to achieve their best outcome. And then we explore a scenario, as I mentioned already, in which if they coordinate, they all agree that they get a very high outcome. Now, again, going back to the issue-based polarization, what we're saying here is that issue polarization leads to a distribution of opinions, and that distribution of opinions leads to a distribution of valuation of the R option. So if we plot the distribution of the rewards, which here we call O, the valuations of the good outcome, we can manipulate the distribution of valuations in the population. Either make it more binomial by increasing this delta mu, or making it more unimodal by making delta mu small. Now, the other piece for human behavior is to understand how many others will cooperate. So if I'm deciding whether to take option R or option S, I want to know ideally how many others will do R versus S, right? So if I believe that a lot of people will do R, then I should choose option R because it has a higher payoff. If, on the other hand, I believe that very few people will play R, then I don't want to play R because I'll get 0 instead of 1. So based on the information that I get from what others will do, I estimate how many will cooperate, and then I make a decision based on that. So the network affects also the dynamics of these individuals. So how do we relate this back to polarization? Well, as I mentioned, effective polarization shapes the network. So this is a more polarized networks in terms of effective polarization because individuals broke their links with others, and this is a less polarized network. And more also importantly, as we saw before, is the interaction between these two. So not just that the network is segregated into these modules, it can also be that the opinions of these individuals could be distributed either randomly in the network, or they could be biased. There's a question? No? Just someone turn on their mic? Can you still hear me?
Preguntas, comentarios.
You're muted, Ricardo. Maybe you're asking questions all the time. You're muted. Ricardo seems to be talking, but he's muted. You are. Now I'm very confused. Ricardo, are you talking to me? You're muted.
I'm so sorry. Well, I have 2 or 3 questions, Victor, but I think it is better to wait to the end.
You think so?
Yeah, really.
Okay,
Well,
then
let's ask you my first question. It is there a parameter in the agent, I mean in the node of your simulation that describe their propensity to change their mind? I mean, if they are very close to change their mind, it's a different question that if I have all my neighbors think different than me, and probably I change my mind. But other people could be, all the people, all my neighbors think different than me, I will continue thinking the same. Is there a parameter that describes or modulates that?
So in this basic model, they're all the same, except that some of them believe that the risky option is better, and others think that it's even better. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Otherwise, they're all the same. But that's a good question, because in particular for polarization, it might happen because of these stubborn individuals, right? Which refuse to change their minds.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay.
You're welcome. And then if you want to ask the other questions later.
At the end.
Okay, good. Yeah, individuals are all the same apart from this difference. So they have different neighbors, and they have different connections,
Yeah.
and they value the risky option differently. Okay. So now what I will show you is the results of this model as a function of the initial number of people that say that they're going to play R. Okay, so I'm sorry, I think I forgot to mention this before, but well, the individuals will look at what the neighbors are doing, they will signal what they want to do, and then they can revise their actions based on the information about what the others are doing. So depending on the initial number of individuals playing R, we will get different results. Okay, so we're going to start by focusing on these two panels here. The first one describes the success rate. So how many groups have achieved the high payoff? Okay, and then the amount of that payoff. Okay, so remember, if everyone chooses to play the safe option, everyone gets a unit of 1. If they decide to use the risky option, they might get more than 1 if they're able to coordinate. Okay, so what we see in terms of success rate is if the number of initial signals of R, and these are honest signals, the number of initial R is very low, then everyone realizes, well, no one's going to play the risky option. I'm also not playing the risky option. So no one really plays the risky option. As the number of initial individuals signaling that they might play R increases, then we see, unsurprisingly, a jump in the success rate of these groups. Now, more interestingly is when we compare the different scenarios. So what are the different scenarios? So we have 2 scenarios where we have homogeneous valuations, right? So maybe I can actually write that. So homogeneous valuations. Yeah, so everyone believes the risky option is equally good. R is equally good. Or they can have heterogeneous valuations. So basically the thick lines are when everyone thinks the same thing. The dashed lines are when people think differently. And now we have the dots, or in the blue line, in the squares are when the networks are fully connected. So it's more like the complete graph. And in the segregated, we have the two clusters. Okay. And then, of course, if evaluations are heterogeneous, so here we also have the fully connected, and here we have them disconnected. We try to do a nice plot. So this would be something like that. And segregated and biased, it's because, you know, the groups think different things. Right? So we have all the scenarios now. So what we see, interestingly, let me go back to my pointer, is that, well, when individuals think alike and they are well connected, so there is no issue-based polarization, and there is no manifestations of affective polarization, because everyone is equally connected, they get the same kind of information. We see that this jump occurs much earlier and it's very consistent. Of course, there is some in the very transition, some groups might not be successful, but for the most part, all groups are successful. Once we introduce heterogeneity, we see that it actually takes off a little bit earlier, but then it doesn't really go up as fast. Now, if we then compare these segregated populations with heterogeneous valuations, then we see that they perform a lot worse in terms of success. Now, more interestingly, at least for me, is when we look at the average payoff. So remember, if they didn't do anything, if they kept just playing the safe option, they would get 1, which is this line here. And now what we see is that when individuals are segregated, and in particular segregated and biased, their final outcome, the average payoff in this population, can be lower than if they just kept with the safe bet. And this shows how polarization can affect basically the economy, in the sense that individuals are not able to coordinate in what they agree is the best options because they cannot assess information properly. And then we have just kind of the explanation of why that is. And it's basically due to miscoordination. Maybe I can come back to this slide later. Now, there is, this is fine, I guess we could have stopped here, but there is a fundamental problem with this analysis. Let me drink some more water. And that problem is that, for instance, well, we are comparing different scenarios, right? And we're looking at the results of different scenarios when, as a function of the initial number of individuals that signal a given strategy. But, for instance, we don't know that when we change the scenario, the initial number doesn't change. So let's say that in this purple scenario, where individuals have heterogeneous valuations and they are segregated and biased, so this here, maybe individuals start by signaling very high levels of R. They're more risky, or they're risk prone. Whereas in the homogeneous setting, they might not. And so in this case, the outcome of the homogeneous setting would be worse than the outcome of the heterogeneous segregated bias setting. Right? So how do we know? So that's why we we collaborated with a group of experimentalists, where we put individuals in these networks and gave them put them in different settings, then asked them to play this game, in particular for this initial round, to assess whether the different scenarios actually cause some bias towards the initial signaling strategy. And well, the results are actually, well, more or less in line with the story that I was telling you. Even without taking into account the evolution of the system, individual behavior is already, well, actually human behavior is already reflects the messages that I was telling you, where if we look at the heterogeneous in segregated populations, we see that, and this is the fraction of players playing R, we see that very few play R. And these are the experimental levels, and this is the final value of the simulation. So the levels in the experiments are already low. And if they are biased, they actually are a bit higher. And that means that they end up in the case where they have a lower payoff because they are investing in this risky option for no reason, and they end up not getting the payoff. Whereas for the homogeneous, well-connected population, we see higher levels of R fractions, and these low, medium, and high is just the valuations. So of course, if valuations are low, you end up in a lower setting. If valuations are higher, then you are more able to coordinate. So overall, experiments show that segregation and biased information affects human behavior, and that misalignment is greatest in this case, where heterogeneous and segregated networks exist. And that is one of the consequences of the combination of affective and issue-based polarization. Now, not everything is bad. One interesting exploration that we did was to look at the role of this mu parameter and the parameters of this distribution, basically trying to look whether having a population of equally minded individuals was always better, which seems a little unlikely. And so what we did identify is that there is this region of intermediate distribution of opinions where individuals are more able to coordinate. So it's this blue region here. And then when we combine this with this type of rewiring dynamics where individuals connect to those that are more like them, then we still, well, that area of optimality is reduced, but we still find that an intermediate level of distribution of opinions is ideal. And actually we can prove the type of distribution that is ideal for this type of coordination process. So to wrap up, the main results are the following. So highly heterogeneous preferences, they worsen the total welfare of the population when compared to the homogeneous scenarios. However, there is an optimal level of heterogeneity. So heterogeneity per se, it's not bad. It's only when that heterogeneity induces these biases that heterogeneity with segregation creates this miscoordination and makes individuals unable to find the good and the effective equilibrium. Yeah, so finally, issue-based polarization is not the cause of the problems, but it is instead segregation of and sorting that have these highly detrimental effects. And that was what I had to tell you. Thank you. Maybe we have a long discussion.
Gracias, doctor. Ricardo.
De nada.
¿Preguntas? ¿Alguien quiere preguntar algo? Uy. Questions?
Questions, preguntas.
Well, I have two other questions. When you talk about the modularity at the first of your talk, yeah, that's right. You're talking. You refer to the existence of communities inside your network.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And a little later, you talk about dynamical polarization, where there is groups, communities, but there are too many connections among these groups. have you considered the creation of an index that describe the translation or the evolution from very unconnected network to dynamical polarization? Because I think that there is a kind of in your last slide. I think there is a kind of phase transition in the form of the curve. You know, there is something here, and suddenly, and later that's right. That's the point.
Yeah.
And probably you can describe this transition defining an index. It's occurred to me that could be the number of link between communities, ponderated by the number of the connection that have the individual node that connect the communities.
Yeah, I can see, I think I agree with you. Here we only tested these two extreme cases, but it would be very cool to explore whether there's this critical transition when this number of connections hits a certain value. I don't have your intuition of which index is the best, but I agree that it needs to incorporate, because it's about the information, right? So it does need to incorporate the number of links of each individual, and also, basically the weight. It's something like the weight of internal to external connections, or something.
That's right. Because if you have a link that connects to connection, and this node here have few neighborhood, this is not so important that if you have a leader here and a leader here, and this is the way in which they connected. I think could be. I'm not quite sure. I think it could be a try. I mean.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So what we also try to do to kind of make this as clean as possible was to have all the individuals with the same degree.
Right.
But something that would be really cool to explore is to actually have more realistic networks where you have heterogeneous degrees and you have these notions of leaders and kind of network periphery, and also then look into how when these valuations are distributed differently depending on the degree, right? Because you can have the guys that are very extreme, that have a very extreme opinion, if they are very central in the network versus if they are in the periphery, that could have a really strong impact in the ability to coordinate. And those are fascinating questions, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. ¿Preguntas?
No se animan.
Caramba, tienen miedo escénico, no lo puedo creer.
Ya hay una en el chat, Ricardo.
Bueno.
What kind of interventions could be managed in order to make better coordination?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think some of the results actually shed some light into this. For instance, well, maybe I'll use the actual final results. Let me move here. I don't know which one is easier, actually. So let's say that we are, maybe the other one is easier, because we also have the drawing. let's say that we are in this situation where individuals are segregated in bias, and so they get very local information. So one of the interventions that we could think of with this model is to change the information flows, right? If we can somehow, and let's say if this happens in a social network or online social network, then we could think of algorithms and just actual rules in which the information can travel from one place to another, so that the population as a whole is able to coordinate in these good outcomes. So one intervention is to provide more information. So share information. The second intervention is to be strategic in how you distribute incentives in your population such that the valuations become closer to optimal, right? So what I showed was that there was, so if the population is very bimodal in terms of how much they value a certain outcome, that is not good, right? So if you provide incentives strategically to a certain set of individuals, then you are actually affecting this distribution, right? So the distribution of valuations changes. So by providing strategic incentives, you can change the shape of the distribution of valuations, and that can trigger cooperation, well, in this case, coordination into the best option. So I think in my mind, those are the two main interventions that we can make through this model, because it's the two kind of dimensions that we've explored. It's the distribution of valuations and the network, the information flows. And I see there is another question. La modelación de la polarización presentada aplica solo a la polarización política o también a la polarización en otros campos ideológica. Yeah, I think the application here is quite general, right? Because it's really about decision making. It's about how much value you attribute to a certain action, and that could be. It could be like, for instance, okay, do I invest in an electric vehicle? Because that's a coordination problem, right? If I know that society is going to change into electrification of everything, then it is more advantageous for me to also buy an electric vehicle, because I know that there will be infrastructure for me to use my car. If I believe that that doesn't happen, that will not happen, then there's very little incentive for me to do it. And that is a very economic decision, right? That depends on the ability of society to coordinate in the best option. So we might all even agree that that's the best option. But if we think that it won't happen because others might not do it, then we end up in the worst situation than we would otherwise. So it's definitely not just about political polarization. It's about how that might affect how we value different technologies, different behaviors, different things, and how that is then distributed in the population.
Good. That was a very good question.
Yeah. Another. Sorry, I cannot answer in Spanish. I understand, but speaking is too much.
Don't worry. Bueno, ¿más preguntas?
Hay otra en el chat.
¿Nuevas? ¿Sí? Sí, hay otra más, mira.
You include cognitive variables in other models and algorithms on the relationships between rulers and ruled. Motivation is a determining factor. Can you comment on this relationship? So let me try to understand a little bit your question. So you want me to comment on the relationship between rulers and ruled? motivation is a determining factor. So not sure I fully understood the question. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more, but I'll just say what I think I understood of your question. In the model, we have biases, for instance, in terms of the information that individuals have, and we have preferences, which give heterogeneity to individuals, and does also change their motivation to do the risky option versus the non-risky option. But we don't have this idea of two roles. So as Ricardo asked before, there is, all individuals are as similar as possible. So there's the idea of ruler and ruled is not incorporated in this model. So I'm not really sure what to think about the question.
The point is that as you said, you don't have include at this time change of behavior because you wish reflect the relationship with the environment, the neighbor.
Yeah, it's true. So in this case, they're just kind of in a negotiation, right? It's like, okay, so my neighbors are doing this, so I'll do that. And then everyone keeps saying what they're going to do. And then in the end, I'll see if they reach which equilibrium they reach. And that's all I did. There is no, there's no intrinsic, there is an intrinsic motivation to all these agents because they value different options differently. But I think this is particularly powerful because they all agree that one of the options is better, right? It's just harder to get. Of course, it would also be very interesting to look into cases where there's actually conflict, so that the issue is so polarized that they actually disagree, right? But then, of course, in that case, of course, we expect that to have an even stronger impact on the ability to coordinate. But then it would be interesting to see whether is the guy that is the bridge between the two communities that disagrees, or if it's someone else in the periphery that disagrees. So it also creates a lot of other interesting questions about the placement of these individuals in these networks, which probably relates to your point about these distinct roles, right? If you have a very central role in your community, and you believe something that's the opposite of others, then that might have a very strong role.
Okay. Any other question?
No, ya no.
Okay, thanks. Well, no more question, Victor.
All right. I can start.
Well, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Your support to our seminars. You have been the last conference of this semester.
Wow.
You are closing our seminar in this semester because the next week was the last, and I think that go to vacations. Thank you very much again, Victor.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure being here. I hope you guys enjoyed.
Thanks.
Muchas gracias, doctor.
De nada.
Gusto en conocerle.
Adiós.
Hasta luego, que esté muy bien.
Cuídense todos.